The rain had started just as Maya's taxi turned onto Maple Street, fat droplets splashing against the windshield like tears she hadn't yet allowed herself to cry. She pressed her face to the cool glass, watching the familiar neighborhood blur past, Mrs. Henderson's rose garden, the Johnsons' blue mailbox with the dented corner, the old oak tree where she'd carved her initials with David 3 summers ago. Everything looked smaller somehow, as if her 2 weeks in Italy had shifted her perspective on more than just gelato flavors and ancient architecture. "This the place?" The driver's gruff voice cut through her reverie as they approached the cream-colored duplex she'd called home for 18 months. The building sat on a gentle slope, its wraparound porch adorned with the hanging ferns she'd spent countless evenings watering while sipping wine and listening to jazz spill from her open windows. Maya nodded, already reaching for her wallet when something made her freeze. There, scattered across the sidewalk like casualties of some domestic war, were cardboard boxes. Brown, weathered, taped hastily and labeled in handwriting that wasn't hers. Her chest tightened as recognition dawned. Those were her dishes, visible through a torn corner, her favorite cerulean blue plates catching the gray afternoon light. "Keep the meter running," she whispered, though her voice felt distant, as if someone else were speaking through her throat. The rain intensified as she stepped onto the curb, her sandals, still dusted with sand from the Amalfi Coast, squelching against the wet pavement. Box after box lined the sidewalk like a yard sale nobody had bothered to advertise. Her grandmother's quilt, wrapped in plastic but already darkening with moisture. The ceramic elephant collection she'd been building since college. Each piece representing a different city, a different dream. Her books, her books, stacked in cardboard that was beginning to buckle under the weight of accumulated rainwater. Maya's hands trembled as she lifted the nearest box, surprised by the lightness. Inside, her winter sweaters were laid folded with military precision, but they smelled wrong, like someone else's laundry detergent, someone else's life. A yellow sticky note was attached to the inside lid. Bedroom closet items, MR. The handwriting was neat, efficient, belonging to someone who approached displacement like a filing system. "Ma'am, you getting back in or what?" The driver's impatience crackled through the rain, but Maya couldn't move. She stood there, surrounded by the archaeology of her existence, trying to understand how she'd gone from sipping espresso in a Roman cafe 12 hours ago to salvaging her life from a soggy sidewalk. The front door of the duplex opened, and Elena Vasquez emerged, her silver hair pinned back in its usual careful bun, her face carrying that particular mixture of guilt and determination that Maya had learned to recognize in her landlady over the past year and a half. Elena had always been fairer, even kind, sending over homemade tamales during Maya's bout with the flu last winter, never complaining when Maya's music ran late into the evening. "Mija," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. She clutched a manila envelope against her chest like armor. "I tried to call you." "I was in Italy," Maya said, the words feeling absurd in the context of her sodden belongings. "I told you I'd be gone for 2 weeks. We talked about this." She gestured helplessly at the boxes. "Elena, what is this?" The older woman's face crumpled slightly. "My nephew, Carlos, he got out of prison last week. He needs a place to stay, and his parole officer, she says he has to have family support, a stable address." Elena's English, usually confident, faltered under the weight of explanation. "I'm sorry, mija. I know this isn't right, but family." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through her linen shirt. "But my lease, we have a contract." Elena extended the manila envelope with shaking hands. "I consulted with a lawyer. It's all here, the notices, the legal papers. California law says I can terminate for family occupancy with 30 days' notice. I tried to call you, sent registered letters to your address."
"I was traveling," Maya repeated, though the words felt hollow. She thought of her carefully planned itinerary, the small hotels with their unreliable Wi-Fi, the deliberate disconnection she'd craved after months of 12-hour days at the graphic design firm. She'd wanted to be unreachable, to exist solely in the moment of cobblestone streets and sunset aperitivos. Now that freedom felt like negligence. The 30 days, they ended yesterday, Elena continued, rain dripping from the small awning above them. I packed everything careful, mija. Nothing broken, nothing lost. I even saved the plant from your kitchen window. She pointed to a small jade plant sitting forlornly atop one of the boxes, its usually vibrant leaves drooping with moisture and shock. Maya opened the envelope with numb fingers. Official letterhead, legal language dense as fog, dates that meant nothing when you were watching sunrise over the Mediterranean, and everything when you were standing in the wreckage of your displaced life. The first notice was dated 3 weeks ago. She'd already been in Florence, probably admiring Michelangelo's David, while her housing security crumbled an ocean away. Where am I supposed to go? The question escaped before Maya could stop it, raw and immediate. She looked up at the duplex that had been her sanctuary, where she'd painted the bathroom a cheerful yellow and learned to make sourdough during the pandemic. The windows looked different now, foreign, as if the building had already forgotten her. Elena's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, mija. I'm so sorry. But Carlos, he has nowhere else. And if he violates parole? She trailed off, the implications hanging in the humid air. Maya nodded slowly, understanding the impossible position, even as she felt her own world narrowing to this moment, this sidewalk, these boxes that contained the careful architecture of her adult life. She thought of her friends back in the city, their cramped apartments and crowded schedules. She thought of her parents in Phoenix, their spare room filled with exercise equipment and 20 years of accumulated disappointment in her daughter's nomadic tendencies. The deposit. My security deposit? In the envelope, full refund plus interest. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice. Mija, I know this isn't enough, but I have some money saved. Let me help you with a hotel tonight. Storage for your things? The offer hung between them like a bridge Maya wasn't sure she could cross. Accepting charity from the woman who just made her homeless felt like swallowing glass, but pride was a luxury she couldn't afford while standing in the rain, surrounded by her life in boxes. Behind Elena, a figure appeared in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with the particular stillness that Maya had learned to associate with men who'd spent time in institutional settings. Carlos Vasquez looked younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with Elena's same dark eyes, but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the doorframe like a question mark. 2 weeks, Maya said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. I was gone for 2 weeks, and everything changed. Life, it moves fast sometimes, faster than we expect. Maya looked at the boxes again, really looked this time. Someone had taken care with her belongings. Clothes folded, dishes wrapped in newspaper, even her bathroom items sealed in plastic bags. This hadn't been done in anger or haste. It had been done with the methodical precision of necessity, the kind of careful destruction that hurt more than carelessness ever could. I need to make some calls, Maya said finally. Figure out where these things are going. The taxi driver honked twice, a sharp sound that cut through the afternoon like an alarm. Maya realized she'd been standing in the rain for nearly 15 minutes, her hair plastered to her head, her vacation clothes, bright and optimistic, now dark with water and circumstance. Take my offer, Elena said urgently. The hotel money, please.
Maya met her landlady's eyes, seeing her own displacement reflected there. 2 women caught in the machinery of family obligations and legal necessities, both trying to navigate the space between kindness and survival. I'll think about it, Maya said, though she already knew she would. Pride was expensive, and she'd spent most of her savings on cobblestone streets and museum admissions, on the luxury of believing that home would be waiting when she returned. She began loading boxes into the taxi's trunk, her movements automatic, while her mind raced through possibilities. Her friend Jessica in Culver City had a couch, but also a new baby and a partner who worked night shifts. Her cousin in San Diego had offered his guest room before, but that was during casual holiday conversations, not desperate midnight phone calls. The storage facility on Pico Boulevard stayed open until 9. She could at least get her belongings out of the rain. As she lifted the box containing her grandmother's quilt, Maya caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. Tucked between the folded fabric was her journal from the Italy trip, its leather cover still bearing the faint aroma of the Roman cafe where she'd written her first entry 2 weeks ago. She'd been so hopeful then,
planning to come home refreshed and ready for new beginnings. The irony tasted bitter as rain. "Mija," Elena called as Maya closed the trunk. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Maya nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. She climbed into the taxi, her wet clothes squeaking against the vinyl seats. As they pulled away from Maple Street, she watched Elena and Carlos retreat into the duplex, her former duplex, their silhouettes disappearing behind the door she no longer had keys to open. "Where to now?" the driver asked, his tone softer than before. Maya pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts while water dripped from her hair onto the screen. The storage facility first, then a hotel. Elena's money would cover one night, maybe two, if she chose carefully. After that, the careful reconstruction of a life she'd thought was more stable than cardboard boxes in the rain. "Pico Storage," she said, giving him the address. "And then we'll see." As the taxi wound through familiar streets that no longer led home, Maya opened her Italy journal to the last entry, written that morning in the airport in Rome. She described the sunrise over the Tiber, the way ancient stones held light like promises. She'd written about coming home to her garden apartment, to her routine of morning coffee on the porch and evening jazz through open windows. She'd written about stability, about roots, about the comfortable predictability of a life that fit her like well-worn jeans. Now she wrote a new line at the bottom of the page. "Some journeys end exactly where they began, but you're not the same person when you arrive." The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of sand from her sandals and the last illusions of permanence from her carefully constructed world. Somewhere ahead lay the work of rebuilding, of finding new four walls to call home, of learning once again that security was often just another word for the temporary arrangement of circumstances beyond her control. But for now, there was only the taxi moving through the gray afternoon, boxes of memories in the trunk, and the strange liberation that came from having nothing left to lose, but everything still to discover. Maya had always been the kind of person who made lists, grocery lists in careful categories, travel itineraries with backup plans for the backup plans, even lists of movies to watch and books to read, ranked by priority and crossed off with the satisfaction of small accomplishments. It was a trait that had served her well in the organized chaos of graphic design, where client revisions and deadline pressures required the kind of methodical approach that turned creative vision into billable hours. Now, sitting in the fluorescent-lit lobby of the Comfort Inn on La Cienega Boulevard, she made a different kind of list, a catalog of everything that had led to this moment. The pen trembled slightly in her grip as she wrote, her handwriting smaller than usual, as if making the words tiny might contain the enormity of what had happened. Things I should have done differently. 1. Given Elena my Italy contact information. 2. Checked my mail before leaving. 3. Not spent my emergency fund on museums and fancy dinners. 4. Stayed home like a responsible adult.
She crossed out the last item immediately, anger flashing through her like heat lightning. She'd worked 60-hour weeks for 8 months to save for that trip, had eaten ramen for lunch more days than she cared to count, had turned down dinners and movies and the small luxuries that made life bearable. The trip hadn't been frivolous, it had been necessary, a pressure valve release before she exploded from the accumulated stress of trying to make partner at a firm where 12 other designers competed for recognition like gladiators in business casual. The hotel room key felt foreign in her palm, its magnetic strip encoding a temporary address that cost $93 per night she couldn't afford. Elena's money would cover 3 nights if she ate vending machine food and pretended that sleeping on scratchy sheets under buzzing fluorescent lights was an adventure, rather than a descent into her worst-case scenario planning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "How was Italy? Send pics!" Maya stared at the message, unsure how to bridge the gap between her friend's expectation of vacation happiness and the reality of sitting in a budget hotel lobby surrounded by plastic bags containing the toiletries she'd managed to salvage from the rain-soaked boxes. The photos on her phone felt like they belonged to someone else. A woman in a red sundress, laughing at a sidewalk cafe, arms spread wide in front of the Colosseum,
eyes bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy that seemed impossible now. She typed and deleted responses for 10 minutes before settling on, "Just got back, need to catch up on some things. Talk soon?" The storage facility had been a blur of fluorescent tubes and concrete hallways that smelled like dust and other people's abandoned dreams. Unit 247 was a 5 by 10 space that cost more per month than she'd spent on groceries, but it was dry and secure and would hold the archaeology of her displaced life until she figured out what came next. The attendant, a kind-faced woman named Rosa, who seemed to understand that Maya was operating in crisis mode, had helped her stack boxes with the efficiency of someone who'd seen this particular dance of desperation before. "First month's rent is prorated," Rosa had said, waving away Maya's attempt to count out exact change from Elena's emergency money. "And honey, things have a way of working out. I've seen people come in here crying and leave 6 months later with keys to a better place than they ever had before." Maya had wanted to believe her, but optimism felt like a luxury she couldn't afford alongside the hotel room and storage unit. Instead, she had nodded and signed the paperwork with hands that still smelled like rain and displacement. Now, in the hotel lobby, she opened her laptop and began the grim work of reconstruction. First, the job situation. She was supposed to be back at the office tomorrow morning, fresh-faced, and ready to tackle the Morrison account redesign. She composed an email to her supervisor, crafting language that conveyed temporary setback without revealing the full scope of her personal catastrophe. "Hi, Janet. I'm back from vacation but dealing with an unexpected housing situation that may impact my schedule this week. I can work remotely on the Morrison project and will keep you updated on my availability for in-person meetings. Thanks for understanding. Maya." The cursor blinked after her name for a long time before she hit send. In the corporate world she had learned to navigate, personal problems were supposed to stay personal, compartmentalized away from the professional persona that wore blazers and attended strategy meetings, and pretended that home was a stable foundation rather than a collection of cardboard boxes in climate-controlled storage. Her phone rang. Jessica, probably tired of waiting for vacation stories. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to her friend's bright, expectant voice asking about Italian men and gelato flavors and whether she'd brought back any good stories. The disconnect between Jessica's world and her current reality felt oceanic.
She scrolled through her contacts, looking for names that might translate to temporary shelter. College friends scattered across the country, coworkers she liked but didn't trust with her vulnerability. Family members whose love came with the kind of strings that made accepting help feel like surrender. Her parents would take her in, she knew, but their Phoenix retirement community was a 40-hour drive away, and their spare room came with pointed questions about her life choices and gentle suggestions about graduate school and settling down. Maya had been 28 for exactly 3 months, and already she felt the weight of societal expectation pressing against her ribcage. Her high school friends were married, buying houses, posting ultrasound pictures on social media with captions about new chapters and blessed beginnings. She'd chosen differently: career over commitment, experiences over equity, the kind of deliberate uncertainty that looked like freedom until it looked like foolishness in the harsh light of a hotel room lobby. The truth was, she'd been happy in her little duplex apartment. Not ecstatically happy, not the kind of happiness that made people write songs or poetry, but contentedly happy in the way of someone who'd finally found a rhythm that worked. Morning coffee on the porch while reading design blogs, evening walks through the neighborhood where she'd learn the names of dogs before their owners, weekend farmers market trips where the vendors knew she'd always choose the slightly bruised peaches because they were cheaper and just as sweet. It had been a small life, maybe, but it had been hers. She'd painted the bedroom walls a soft sage green because sage made her feel calm. She'd hung string lights in the kitchen because they made ordinary Tuesday night dinners feel like celebrations. She'd arranged her furniture to catch the afternoon light perfectly, creating a reading nook where she'd spent countless hours lost in other people's stories while constructing her own quiet contentment. Now that contentment felt naive, like a child's belief in permanence. She'd built her stability on sand, on a month-to-month lease and a landlady's goodwill, and the tide of other people's needs had washed it away while she'd been eating pasta and admiring Renaissance art. Maya closed the laptop and walked to the hotel's small business center, where an ancient desktop computer wheezed through the process of loading Craigslist. The rental listings looked like a foreign language written in acronyms and optimism. Charming studio with shared kitchen. $1,200 a month, first, last, and deposit. Credit check required. No pets, smoking, or overnight guests. She did the math in her head, the same calculation she'd been avoiding for hours. Her savings account, depleted by the Italy trip, held maybe $1,500. Her checking account had enough to cover her regular expenses for 2 weeks, assuming she didn't eat or need shelter or transportation. The storage unit and hotel room were already eating into Elena's emergency money like hungry creatures. The security deposits alone would require funds she didn't have, and most landlords wanted proof of income that exceeded 3 times the monthly rent. On paper, her salary looked adequate, but in the reality of Los Angeles housing prices, adequate was a relative term that didn't account for the gulf between gross income and take-home pay after taxes and health insurance and the student loan payments that followed her like faithful dogs. She printed out 3 listings that seemed possible: a room in a shared house in Silver Lake, a converted garage in Los Feliz, and a studio apartment in a building that looked institutional but affordable. Each required an application fee, background check, and leap of faith that felt impossible from her current position at the bottom of circumstance. Walking back through the lobby, Maya caught her reflection in the mirrored elevator doors. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd been caught off guard by life, whose vacation glow had been washed away by rain and reality. Her dark hair, which had looked so effortlessly tousled in the Italian sun, now hung limp and defeated. The linen pants that had seemed so chic in Rome were wrinkled beyond repair, and her eyes carried the particular exhaustion that came from having all your assumptions upended in the space of an afternoon. The hotel room was a study in beige functionality, 2 double beds, a desk with a missing drawer pull, a view of the parking lot where palm trees struggled against urban neglect. Maya spread the printouts across one bed and her laptop on the other, creating a command center for the campaign to reconstruct her life. She started with phone calls, her voice growing smaller with each conversation. The Silver Lake house had already been rented. The Los Feliz garage was available but required first and last month rent, plus a deposit that totaled more than she had in both accounts. The studio apartment was still available, and the landlord agreed to show it tomorrow afternoon, but his tone suggested the kind of scrutiny that would reveal her current homelessness like a character flaw.
By 8 o'clock, Maya had filled 3 pages of her notebook with phone numbers and rejection reasons, creating a catalog of closed doors that felt like a new kind of mathematics she'd never learned to calculate. She ordered Chinese food from the place next door to the hotel, lo mein and egg rolls that tasted like salt and obligation, and ate while sitting cross-legged on the bed, laptop balanced on her knees. Her Italy journal lay open beside her takeout container, and she found herself reading her entries from 2 weeks ago like historical documents from another person's life. She'd written about the light in Florence, the way it turned ordinary buildings into something transcendent. She'd described conversations with fellow travelers, the easy intimacy that came from shared wonder at ancient beauty. She'd been so certain that she was returning to something stable, so confident that home was a constant rather than a variable in the equation of her life. Now she wrote, Day 1 of displacement. Everything I thought I knew about security was based on the illusion of control. I believed that if I paid my rent on time and didn't cause trouble and kept my head down and worked hard, the universe would respect my diligence with stability. But stability is just another word for the temporary alignment of other people's needs with your own. Elena needed her nephew to have a place to stay more than she needed to honor our lease. The law gave her the power to choose. I gave her the opportunity by being unreachable.
The hardest part isn't the inconvenience or even the fear. It's the way this makes me question every other assumption I've built my adult life on. If home isn't permanent, what is? If a lease isn't security, then what constitutes safety? I keep thinking about the boxes on the sidewalk, how carefully someone had packed my life away. There was kindness in that care, which somehow makes it worse. This wasn't done in malice. This was done in the space between impossible choices, where someone else's emergency became my catastrophe. Maya set down her pen and looked around the hotel room, at the generic artwork bolted to the walls, the carpet that had seen too many temporary residents, the window that offered a view of nothing she recognized. Tomorrow, she would put on her most professional outfit and tour apartments she couldn't afford while pretending to be the kind of stable, employed person that landlords preferred. She would smile and ask intelligent questions about lease terms and amenities while calculating how many meals she could skip to afford security deposits. But tonight, she was just a woman in a hotel room, surrounded by the debris of assumptions, learning that sometimes the greatest distances weren't measured in miles, but in the space between who you thought you were and whose circumstances revealed you to be. Her phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. "Starting to worry about you. Call me?" Maya typed back, "Tomorrow, promise." Some conversations required more stability than she could currently provide, more coherence than she could manage while sitting on a hotel bed surrounded by printouts of other people's homes. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of rebuilding, of finding new foundations for the life that had been packed away with such careful kindness, while she'd been learning that even the most beautiful journeys eventually required a destination. For now, there was only the unfamiliar quiet of a room that belonged to no one, and the strange comfort of finally having nothing left to lose except the hope that tomorrow might offer something better than today's careful catastrophe. Maya discovered the first crack in her professional facade during the Tuesday morning staff meeting when Janet asked how her vacation had been and expected more than a one-word answer. The Morrison account materials spread across the conference table like evidence of a life that felt increasingly remote. Bright, optimistic marketing copy for a luxury hotel chain, complete with stock photography of couples laughing on pristine beaches and families building sandcastles under perfect blue skies. Italy was transformative, Maya said, the word tasting false as she spoke it. Around the table, her colleagues smiled with the polite interest of people who hadn't spent the previous night researching extended stay motels and calculating how many nights she could afford on her rapidly dwindling funds. "Bring us back any inspiration for the campaign?" asked Trevor, the senior designer whose corner office Maya had been coveting for 18 months. He gestured at the hotel mock-ups with the casual confidence of someone whose home address hadn't changed in a decade. Maya nodded, pulling up photos on her laptop of sun-drenched piazzas and ancient fountains, forcing enthusiasm into her voice as she described color palettes inspired by Roman sunsets and typography echoes from Venetian architecture. The presentation went well. She'd always been good at translating experience into commercial application, but she felt like an actress playing a role, speaking lines about creative inspiration while her real creative energy was consumed by the logistics of basic survival. After the meeting, she retreated to her cubicle and opened 17 new browser tabs: apartment listings, extended stay motels, subletting opportunities, and increasingly desperate searches for emergency housing assistance, Los Angeles. The city's rental market was a predator that fed on desperation, and Maya was learning the hard way that being employed wasn't the same as being financially powerful enough to command respect from landlords who could choose among dozens of applicants for every available unit. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Haven't heard from you since you got back. How was the trip? Dad wants to know if you brought him anything from the Vatican gift shop." Maya stared at the message for a long time, imagining the conversation that would follow if she called home. Her parents loved her, she knew that, but their love came wrapped in a particular kind of concern that felt like judgment.
They'd never understood her choice to stay in Los Angeles, to pursue a creative career that didn't offer the kind of stability they'd built their lives around. Her father was a retired accountant, her mother a former elementary school teacher. People who'd bought their house in 1987 and paid it off early, who'd never moved more than 50 miles from where they'd been born. Trip was amazing, still settling back in. We'll call soon. She'd been saying, "We'll call soon," for 3 days now, using the promise of future contact to avoid the reality of present circumstances. How do you tell your parents that their daughter, who'd always prided herself on independence and competence, was homeless? How do you explain that 28 years of careful choices and responsible behavior could be undone by 2 weeks of unreachable vacation bliss? The apartment viewing that afternoon was a masterclass in humiliation disguised as due diligence. The studio was in a building that had clearly seen better decades. Its Art Deco facade marred by poorly painted patch jobs and windows that didn't quite fit their frames. The landlord, named Rick, who wore the kind of pinky ring that suggested complicated financial arrangements, looked Maya up and down like she was applying for membership in an exclusive club rather than paying rent for 400 square feet of questionable housing. "Income verification?" Rick asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question. Maya handed over her employment letter and pay stubs, documents that looked impressive until you calculated them against Los Angeles cost of living. Rick studied the papers with the thoroughness of an IRS auditor, while Maya tried not to notice the brown stains on the bathroom ceiling or the kitchen window that was covered with what appeared to be aluminum foil. "Credit score?" Rick continued. 742, Maya said, grateful that this was the one number that still worked in her favor. "References from previous landlords?" This was where the conversation always derailed. Maya explained about Elena, about the family emergency that had necessitated her displacement, about the perfectly amicable relationship that had ended through no fault of her own. Rick's expression suggested he'd heard variations of this story before, usually from people whose rent checks bounced or who left apartments in states that required professional hazmat teams. "Look," Rick said, leaning against the kitchen counter in a way that made the whole structure shake slightly. "I got 3 other applicants for this place. All of them currently housed, all of them with references that don't involve family drama. You seem nice enough, but nice doesn't pay rent when life gets complicated again." Maya felt her professional composure cracking around the edges. "My employment is stable. I've never been late on rent, never caused property damage, never had complaints from neighbors. I'm literally homeless through no fault of my own."
Homeless. Rick repeated the word like it explained everything. Yeah, see, that's exactly what I'm talking about. People in stable housing situations don't become homeless. Something else is going on here. The injustice of his logic hit Maya like a physical blow. She was being penalized for her displacement, as if homelessness were a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Rick's assumption that stable people stayed housed revealed the kind of circular reasoning that kept desperate people desperate. You couldn't get housing because you didn't have housing, couldn't prove stability because your stability had been disrupted by forces beyond your control. "I understand your concerns," Maya said, though understanding and accepting were different things entirely. What would it take to overcome them? Rick seemed to consider this, his calculation visible in the way his eyes moved between Maya's professional attire and the apartment's gouged hardwood floors. Double security deposit, first and last month's rent up front, plus a co-signer with a credit score above 800 and local property ownership. The numbers hit Maya like a series of slaps. Even if she'd had $4,000 readily available, which she didn't, finding a co-signer with those qualifications would require admitting to someone in her life that she needed the kind of help that came with legal obligations and potential financial liability. "I'll need to think about it,"
Maya said, the phrase feeling like surrender even as she spoke it. Sure thing, but don't think too long. This place won't stay available forever. Walking back to her car, parked 3 blocks away to avoid the meter fees she could no longer afford, Maya felt the weight of another door closing. The afternoon sun, which had seemed so warm and welcoming in Italy, now beat down with the oppressive heat of a city that offered plenty of opportunities for people with resources and very little mercy for those without them. Her phone rang as she sat in the driver's seat, air conditioning blasting against the suffocating interior heat. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and Maya realized she couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. "There you are!" Jessica's voice carried the particular brightness of new motherhood, that combination of exhaustion and euphoria that made everything seem both urgent and magical. "Not exactly," Maya said, though she couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap between Jessica's expectation of vacation stories and the reality of apartment hunting from a hotel room. "So tell me everything. Did you fall in love? Did you eat your weight in gelato? Did you bring me back something fabulous?" Maya found herself crying before she realized tears were coming, the accumulated stress of 3 days finally finding release in the safety of Jessica's familiar voice. The crying started quietly, but quickly escalated into the kind of sobbing that comes from holding too much inside for too long. "Maya, oh, honey, what's wrong?" Through tears and halting explanations, Maya told her the story. The boxes on the sidewalk, the hotel room, the apartment viewings that felt like auditions for a role she wasn't qualified to play. Jessica listened with the kind of active silence that indicated full attention, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage at the appropriate moments. "Why didn't you call me immediately?" Jessica asked when Maya had finished. "You know David and I would have figured something out."
Because you have a 3-month-old baby and a 1-bedroom apartment and a partner who works night shifts, Maya said. Because your life is already complicated enough without adding my homelessness to the mix. Don't be ridiculous. We're friends. This is what friends do. But Maya had learned over the past 3 days that friendship had practical limitations that nobody talked about when times were good. People offered help in the abstract, but concrete assistance required resources and space and emotional energy that everyone was already using for their own survival. Jessica meant well, but her offer came from the luxury of stable housing and predictable income, from a life where homelessness was other people's problem, rather than immediate reality. "I appreciate it," Maya said. "I really do, but I need to figure this out on my own." "That's not how friendship works, Maya. That's not how any of this works." After they hung up, Jessica promising to brainstorm solutions and Maya promising to accept help if things got worse, Maya sat in her car and watched people walk past on their way to lives that looked effortless from the outside. A woman in yoga clothes carrying an expensive coffee, probably heading home to an apartment she'd lived in long enough to paint the walls. A man walking a dog, stopping to pick up mail from a box that had his name on it in permanent letters. The casual confidence of people whose addresses were fixed points rather than daily uncertainties. The hotel room that evening felt smaller than it had the night before, as if the walls were contracting around her temporary residence. Maya spread apartment listings across the polyester bedspread and created a new kind of mathematics, calculating application fees against declining funds, weighing the cost of hope against the price of repeated rejection. She'd started keeping a journal of the search, documenting the particular ways that homelessness revealed itself in daily interactions. Day 4. Viewed apartment in Las Vegas. Landlord asked why I was looking to move so suddenly. Realized that housed people move on schedules, end of lease, job changes, life transitions that allow for planning. Homeless people move immediately, out of necessity, which looks suspicious to people who associate housing stability with moral stability. Day 5. Applied for studio in Hollywood. Application asked for current address. Wrote down hotel information, then wondered if that would disqualify me immediately. Called back to ask if they needed permanent address or if temporary was acceptable for application purposes. Receptionist said, temporary addresses raise red flags, as if homelessness were contagious. Day 6. Discovered that many apartment listings are scams. Responded to ad for Charming 1BR, $900 a month, and received a request for wire transfer to secure the property. Realized my desperation was making me vulnerable to predators who fed on other people's housing insecurity. Maya's laptop screen glowed with 17 open tabs of rental websites, each one promising affordable housing that evaporated upon closer inspection. Studios listed at $1,500 turned out to require an additional $300 for parking. Income-based apartments had waiting lists measured in years rather than weeks. The city's affordable housing program seemed designed by people who'd never actually needed affordable housing, requiring documentation and waiting periods that assumed applicants had stable addresses to receive mail and time to navigate bureaucratic mazes. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Maya. This is David, Elena's nephew. Got your number from Aunt Elena. Wanted to say sorry about the situation. I know it's not fair to you." She started the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to lash out at the stranger whose parole requirements had upended her life, but a larger part recognized that Carlos was as much a victim of circumstances as she was. The criminal justice system that had incarcerated him and the housing market that had displaced her were parts of the same machinery that churned people through cycles of instability and called it justice. "Thanks for reaching out. Hope you're getting settled okay." She sent the message before she could second-guess the kindness in it. 3 dots appeared immediately, indicating he was typing a response.
Aunt Elena feels terrible. She wanted me to ask if there's anything we can do to help. I know it's weird coming from me, but she's been crying about this for days. The image of Elena crying made Maya's chest tighten with complicated emotions. She'd been so focused on her own displacement that she hadn't considered the toll the situation was taking on her former landlady. Elena had been caught between legal obligations and family loyalty, forced to choose between her nephew's freedom and her tenant's stability. There was no good choice in that equation, only different kinds of harm distributed among people who didn't deserve any of it. Tell her not to worry. I understand why she had to make this choice. But understanding didn't make the hotel room feel any less temporary, didn't make apartment hunting any less humiliating, didn't transform her displacement from practical problem into philosophical acceptance. The next morning brought Maya's first real professional crisis since the displacement began. She overslept. The hotel's thin walls and unfamiliar sounds had kept her awake until nearly 3 a.m., and arrived at the office 45 minutes late to find Janet waiting by her cubicle with the particular expression that supervisors wore when patience was wearing thin. "We need to talk," Janet said, gesturing toward the conference room. She followed, her stomach dropping with the recognition that her personal catastrophe was about to collide with her professional stability. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and accumulated stress, fluorescent lights humming overhead with the persistence of urban anxiety. "I'm going to be direct," Janet said, settling into the chair across from Maya with the careful positioning of someone preparing to deliver difficult news. "Your work quality hasn't changed, but your availability has. You've been distracted in meetings, you've missed 2 client calls, and Trevor mentioned that you seemed, quote-unquote, emotionally volatile during yesterday's creative review." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. Trevor had questioned her color choices for the Morrison campaign, suggesting that her Italian-inspired palette was too European for American hotel guests. She'd defended her creative decisions with perhaps more intensity than the situation warranted, but she'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and the accumulated stress of 4 apartment rejections. "I'm dealing with some temporary housing issues," Maya said carefully, "but they won't impact my work performance long term." "Maya, I like you. You're talented and you've been reliable for 18 months. But this company doesn't have the bandwidth to carry employees through extended personal crises. We need people who can compartmentalize their personal lives and maintain professional consistency." The word compartmentalize hit Maya like a slap. How do you compartmentalize homelessness? How do you separate your professional identity from the reality that you're living in a hotel room and applying for apartments during lunch breaks? The expectation that personal catastrophe could be neatly contained during business hours revealed the kind of privilege that Janet took for granted. A stable home address, predictable housing costs,
The luxury of treating work as separate from survival. I understand, though she didn't understand at all. What do you need from me? Consistent availability, reliable performance. And honestly, some indication that you're getting your personal situation under control. I can give you 2 weeks to sort things out, but after that, we need to have a serious conversation about whether this position is still the right fit. Walking back to her cubicle, Maya felt the walls of her life contracting further. The job she'd worked so hard to secure was now threatened by the homelessness that made her desperate to keep it. She was trapped in the particular kind of catch-22 that American capitalism specializes in creating, needing employment to afford housing while needing housing to maintain employment.
Her computer screen showed 3 new emails from landlords, 2 rejections and 1 request for additional documentation that she didn't have. The Silver Lake house wanted letters from her bank, her employer, and 2 character references. The Hollywood apartment had been rented to someone else, someone whose application didn't raise the red flags that apparently accompanied temporary addresses. Maya opened a new document and began typing. Subject: Housing Reference Request. Hi, Jessica. I know this is awkward, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to serve as a character reference for apartment applications. Landlords seem to want confirmation that I'm not some kind of housing criminal, and you've known me longer than anyone else in LA. I understand if this feels like too much responsibility, but I'm running out of options and running out of time. Maya sent similar messages to 3 other friends, each email a small admission of defeat. Maya had always prided herself on independence, on solving her own problems without burdening other people with her needs. Now she was learning that independence was another luxury that required stable foundations, that asking for help was often the first step in a longer journey toward accepting how little control any of us actually had over our circumstances. The responses came back throughout the afternoon. Jessica replied immediately with enthusiastic support and 3 referrals to friends who might know of available apartments. David, her college roommate, not Jessica's partner, offered to co-sign a lease if she found something reasonable. Her friend Marcus from the yoga studio sent contact information for a housing nonprofit that helped with security deposits. Each offer of help was genuine, and each one highlighted the resources that Maya had been too proud to access while she still believed she could solve this problem through individual effort and professional competence. The humiliation of accepting assistance was gradually being replaced by something else. A recognition that the myth of self-reliance was often just another way of saying that some people had better safety nets than others. But even with character references and co-signer offers, the basic mathematics of Los Angeles housing remained unchanged. Landlords could choose among multiple qualified applicants for every available unit, and given the choice between someone currently housed and someone living in a hotel, the decision was obvious. Maya's homelessness marked her as risky, even when her employment history and credit score suggested otherwise. By Thursday evening, Maya had viewed 11 apartments, applied for 7, and been rejected by 5. The 2 pending applications represented her best remaining chances: a studio in a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who actively disliked natural light, and a room in a shared house where her potential roommates were 3 aspiring actors who seemed to subsist entirely on protein powder and networking opportunities. Day 8. Applied for studio apartment that costs 60% of my take-home income. Landlord asked if I had a backup plan in case of job loss. Wondered if housed people have backup plans or if they just assume stability will continue indefinitely. My backup plan is apparently Elena's emergency money and the kindness of friends who have couches. Day 9. Friend from work mentioned casually that her rent hasn't increased in 3 years because she has a good relationship with her landlord. Realized that housing stability often depends on social capital as much as financial capital. The relationships you build when you're housed become the safety net that keeps you housed. But when you're displaced, you lose access to that social capital exactly when you need it most. Maya closed the journal and stared out the hotel window at the parking lot where her car sat among others that belonged to temporarily displaced people. Somewhere in the city, there were apartments sitting empty while their owners waited for the perfect tenant. people sleeping in cars because they couldn't afford security deposits, families crowded into single rooms because the alternative was separation. The housing crisis wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, immediate, and apparently designed to punish anyone whose stability could be disrupted by the normal catastrophes of contemporary life. Maya had learned that being a good tenant, employee, and person wasn't enough to guarantee housing security, that the systems meant to provide stability were often the same systems that created instability for people who couldn't afford to navigate their contradictions. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Getting worried that we haven't talked since you got back. Everything okay?" Maya typed and deleted responses for 10 minutes before settling on truth. "Having some housing issues, but working through them. We'll call this weekend." Housing issues felt like code for something more manageable than homelessness, more temporary than the growing realization that her displacement might not be a brief inconvenience between stable situations, but a glimpse into the precarious reality that most people lived with while pretending otherwise. Outside her window, the sun was setting over a city full of people going home to places they took for granted, inserting keys into locks that opened onto their own spaces, turning on lights and adjusting thermostats, and making small decisions about dinner and television that required the foundation of home. Maya pressed her face against the glass and watched them disappear into buildings that held their lives, wondering when she would join them again, or if she was learning to live in the spaces between permanent things, in the geography of the temporarily housed, in the economy of emergency that had become her new normal. The call came on Friday morning when Maya was sitting in her car outside a coffee shop in Echo Park, rehearsing what she would say to yet another landlord who would probably find reasons to choose someone else. Her phone displayed Elena's number, and Maya hesitated before answering, unsure whether she was ready for another conversation that would require forgiveness she didn't entirely feel. "Mija?" Elena's voice was thick with what sounded like tears or exhaustion or both. "I need to tell you something. About Carlos. About why everything happened the way it did." Maya pulled into a parking space, recognizing the weight in Elena's voice as the kind that preceded revelations that changed the shape of understanding. "What's going on? Can you meet me at the house? There are things you should know, things I should have told you before." 20 minutes later, Maya found herself standing on the familiar porch of the duplex that had been her home, looking at Elena through the screen door like a visitor to her own former life. The older woman looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever burden she was preparing to share.
"Come in, please," Elena said. "Carlos is at work. He got a job at the auto shop on Sunset. I wanted to talk to you alone." The apartment looked different from Maya's brief glimpse through the doorway a week ago. Carlos had moved in completely, his presence filling the spaces that had once held Maya's furniture with a careful arrangement of second-hand items that suggested someone trying to build a life from whatever was available. The walls still carried the faint impressions of her picture frames, ghost marks that outlined the shapes of a home that no longer existed. Elena gestured toward the kitchen table, Maya's former kitchen table now serving Carlos's needs, and began speaking before they'd fully settled into chairs. "The lawyer I consulted, he didn't just tell me about the family occupancy laws," Elena said, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug like it was an anchor. "He told me other things, about Carlos's case, about why he was in prison, about what might happen if his parole officer decided he wasn't in compliance." Maya waited, sensing that whatever Elena was about to reveal would reframe everything she thought she understood about her displacement. "My nephew, he was convicted of drug possession. Not dealing, not selling, just possession. But it was his third strike, and California's 3 strikes law, it doesn't distinguish between violent crimes and nonviolent ones. He was sentenced to 15 years for having cocaine in his car." The number hit Maya like a physical blow. 15 years. She thought of her own life 15 years ago. She'd been 13, worried about middle school social dynamics and whether she'd make the volleyball team. Carlos had been sent to prison for the kind of mistake that might have cost someone else a fine and community service, but his previous convictions had transformed personal failure into societal exile. The lawyer explained that if Carlos violated any condition of his parole,
including not having stable housing with family support, he would be sent back to prison to finish his full sentence. Not 15 years, mija. 23 years. The additional time for parole violation, it would have meant he wouldn't get out until he was 55. Elena's voice cracked as she continued. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let my sister's son disappear into prison for 2 decades because I couldn't help him. But I also couldn't bear to hurt you, to take away your home like that. Maya felt the foundation of her anger shifting beneath her feet. For a week, she'd been viewing her displacement as the result of family preference over legal obligation, Elena choosing blood over contract. Now she understood that Elena had been choosing between Carlos's freedom and Maya's immediate housing security. Why didn't you tell me this before? Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. Because I was ashamed, she said simply. Ashamed that my family's problems became your crisis. Ashamed that the system that was supposed to rehabilitate my nephew instead made it impossible for him to reintegrate without destroying other people's lives. Ashamed that I had to choose between 2 people I cared about. Maya looked around the apartment that had been hers, seeing it now as the space that stood between Carlos and 2 decades of incarceration. The sage-green bedroom walls she'd painted with such care, the kitchen window where she'd grown herbs, the reading nook where she had spent countless evenings, all of it had become the foundation for someone else's chance at life outside prison walls. The lawyer also told me something else, about tenant rates, about what I was supposed to do differently. The 30-day notice, it should have been served in person or by certified mail. I should have tried harder to reach you, should have consulted with you before making the decision to terminate your lease. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying that legally your eviction might not have been valid. The lawyer said that if you challenged it in court, you might be able to get your housing back or at least compensation for the illegal displacement. The revelation hit Maya like a series of small explosions. Not only had she been made homeless to save Carlos from returning to prison, but her homelessness might have been legally unnecessary. Elena's panic about her nephew's situation had led to hasty decisions that violated tenant protection laws designed to prevent this kind of displacement.
But if I challenge it, Maya said slowly, working through the implications, Carlos loses his housing, and if he loses his housing, he goes back to prison for 23 years, Elena finished. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of impossible choices settling between them like a familiar ghost. Maya understood now that her displacement hadn't been the result of simple family preference, but part of a larger system that created cascading crises for people who couldn't afford to navigate its contradictions. Carlos's incarceration had been extended by laws that treated addiction as a moral failing rather than a health issue. His reintegration was made dependent on family resources that most people didn't have. Elena's attempt to help her nephew had violated tenant rights she didn't fully understand. Maya's housing security had been undermined by legal protections that existed on paper, but weren't accessible to people who couldn't afford lawyers to enforce them. There's something else, Elena said, reaching into a manila envelope that Maya hadn't noticed on the table. The rental history you need for apartment applications. I can provide references that explain the situation, that make it clear your displacement wasn't due to any problems with your tenancy. She pulled out several sheets of official-looking letterhead, letters explaining that you were a model tenant, that the lease termination was due to emergency family circumstances, that you left the property in perfect condition, and your security deposit was returned in full. Maya accepted the papers, scanning language that transformed her displacement from red flag to unfortunate circumstance. The letters were detailed, professional, designed to overcome landlord's suspicions about why someone might be looking for housing immediately rather than at the end of a planned lease term. There's something else, Elena said, reaching into a manila envelope that Maya hadn't noticed on the table. The rental history you need for apartment applications. I can provide references that explain the situation, that make it clear your displacement wasn't due to any problems with your tenancy. She pulled out several sheets of official-looking letterhead, letters explaining that you were a model tenant,
that the lease termination was due to emergency family circumstances, that you left the property in perfect condition, and your security deposit was returned in full. The offer hung in the air like a bridge Maya wasn't sure she could cross. Accepting Elena's help felt like participating in the very system that had displaced her, using personal connections to bypass the barriers that kept other people homeless. But refusing the help would mean continuing to navigate an apartment market designed to exclude people whose circumstances had been complicated by forces beyond their control. "What's the rent?" Maya asked practically. $1,200 a month, below market rate because the building is older and Maria prefers long-term tenants over maximum profit. Maya did the math in her head. With her salary, $1,200 was manageable, not comfortable, but sustainable. It would mean eating cheaper food and skipping small luxuries, but it would mean having an address, having keys, having the foundation necessary to rebuild stability. "I don't know how to feel about this," Maya said honestly. "Part of me is grateful, and part of me is angry that it took a week of homelessness to get access to resources that could have prevented the displacement in the first place." Elena nodded. "I understand. I should have handled everything differently from the beginning. Should have been honest about the situation. Should have tried harder to find solutions that didn't hurt you." "But you were trying to keep your nephew out of prison for 23 years, Maya said. "I'm not sure anyone would have made different choices in that situation." The recognition of Elena's impossible position didn't eliminate Maya's anger about her displacement, but it complicated that anger in ways that felt more accurate to the complex
realities of how people survived systems designed to create scarcity and competition rather than support and collaboration. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Need to discuss your availability for next week's client presentations. Can you stay late today for planning meeting?" The request that would have felt routine a week ago now highlighted the precarious balance Maya was trying to maintain between professional obligations and basic survival needs. She was being asked to commit to evening work while living in a hotel room and apartment hunting during lunch breaks, to perform stability while experiencing its absence. "I should probably take the apartment," Maya said, surprising herself with the decision even as she spoke it. "I need housing, and this seems like the best option available." Elena's relief was visible in the way her shoulders relaxed and her breathing deepened. "Maria can meet with you this afternoon if you want. The apartment won't be ready until Monday, but you can see it, sign the lease, make arrangements." Maya nodded, already calculating the logistics of moving from hotel room to actual residence. Her belongings were in storage, her savings were depleted, but she would have an address again, a place to receive mail and make coffee and hang pictures on walls that wouldn't charge her by the night. "There's one more thing," Elena said hesitantly. "Carlos wanted to contribute to your security deposit. He's been saving money from his job and he feels responsible for the situation." The offer from Carlos felt like a completion of some circle Maya couldn't quite map. The man whose freedom had required her displacement was trying to make reparations for harm that had been systemic rather than personal. His contribution wouldn't undo the week of homelessness or the professional stress or the accumulated humiliation of being temporarily without place, but it represented an acknowledgement that their fates had been connected by forces larger than individual choice. "Tell him that's not necessary," Maya said, "but tell him I appreciate the offer." Elena walked her to the door, the familiar porch now feeling like neutral territory rather than home or exile. The afternoon sun was warm against Maya's face, and for the first time in a week, she could imagine a future that included waking up in the same place 2 days in a row. "Mija," Elena said as Maya reached the sidewalk, "I'm sorry for everything, for the way it happened, for the timing, for not being more honest from the beginning." Maya turned back to look at her former landlady, this woman who'd been trying to navigate impossible choices with insufficient resources and imperfect information. Elena's face carried the particular exhaustion of people who learned that sometimes there were no good choices, only different distributions of harm among people who deserved better. "I'm sorry too," Maya said. "For Carlos, for the situation he was put in, for the system that made your choice necessary." Driving away from Maple Street, Maya felt something shifting in her understanding of the past week.
Her displacement hadn't been the result of simple injustice or personal failing, but part of larger patterns of how American society managed poverty, addiction, housing, and incarceration. Elena's family emergency had collided with tenant protection laws that existed in theory, but were difficult to access in practice. Carlos's reintegration had been made dependent on housing resources that were already scarce. Maya's housing security had been built on foundations that could be disrupted by other people's emergencies. The apartment in Los Feliz turned out to be everything Elena had described: small but clean, older but well-maintained, affordable by Los Angeles standards, but requiring the kind of personal reference that most people couldn't access. Elena's cousin Maria Vasquez was a woman in her 50s who managed the building with the efficiency of someone who understood that housing was both business and human need. "Elena explained your situation," Maria said as they toured the compact one-bedroom unit. "Family emergencies, they happen to everyone. What matters is how people handle the disruption." The apartment had character that modern buildings lacked: built-in bookshelves, original hardwood floors, windows that actually opened to let in air and light. The kitchen was tiny but functional, the bedroom was small but could accommodate my furniture, and the living area had enough space for my reading chair and the plants that she'd been keeping alive in storage. "When can you move in?" Maria asked. "Monday," Maya said, the word feeling like the first solid ground she had found in a week. They completed the paperwork in Maria's office, a converted apartment on the ground floor filled with filing cabinets and the accumulated documentation of people's housing histories. Maya signed the lease with the particular care of someone who understood that home was a legal contract as much as an emotional space. Walking back to her car, Maya pulled out her phone and scrolled to Jessica's number. "Please tell me you have good news," Jessica answered on the first ring. "I found an apartment," Maya said, and heard her friend's squeal of excitement through the phone. "Tell me everything! Where is it? When do you move in? Do you need help with anything?" For the first time in a week, Maya found herself laughing. Not the bitter laughter of ironic recognition, but the genuine laughter of relief and possibility. She had an address again, keys that would unlock her own space, the foundation necessary to begin rebuilding the life that had been packed away in careful boxes, while she was learning that even ancient stones could be moved by forces beyond their control. The hotel room that evening felt different, temporary in the way that all transitions were temporary, rather than in the way that homelessness was temporary. Maya spread apartment listings across the polyester bedspread one last time, not because she needed them anymore, but because she wanted to remember what it felt like to search for home while living nowhere. Her Italy journal lay open beside her, and she wrote, "Day 10, found housing. Not through individual merit or professional competence or any of the myths I'd been believing about how stability was earned and maintained. Found housing through personal connections, family networks, and the kind of social capital that most people don't even realize they're using until they don't have it." Elena's revelation today changed everything and nothing. Everything because I understand now that my displacement was part of larger systems rather than personal failure. Nothing because the week of homelessness still happened. The professional stress still occurred. The humiliation was still real. But maybe understanding the systems is the first step towards surviving them. Maybe recognizing that housing insecurity is structural rather than individual opens space for different kinds of solutions, different ways of supporting each other through the gaps between what we deserve and what we can access. Tomorrow, I'll go back to work and pretend that this has been resolved, that housing is once again a stable foundation rather than a daily uncertainty. But I'll know something now that I didn't know 2 weeks ago, that home is not a reward for good behavior, but a human need that shouldn't be dependent on other people's emergencies, on family connections, on the particular alignment of circumstances that allows some people to stay housed while others cycle through temporary solutions that cost more than permanent ones.
Maya closed the journal and looked around the hotel room one last time, trying to memorize what temporary felt like so she would never take permanent for granted again. Monday, she would move into the Los Feliz apartment, unpack her boxes, arrange her furniture, and begin the work of rebuilding routine around new walls. But tonight, she was still between homes, still learning that the distance between housed and homeless was often measured not in miles or years, but in the span of circumstances beyond individual control, in the space between one emergency and the next, in the geography of systems designed to create scarcity rather than ensure that everyone had the foundation necessary to build whatever kind of life their resources and dreams could sustain.
Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made Los Angeles feel like a city where fresh starts were possible. Maya stood in the storage facility at 7 a.m., surrounded by the boxes that contained her displaced life, feeling something she hadn't experienced in nearly 2 weeks, the luxury of planning beyond the current day. Jessica had insisted on helping with the move, arriving with David and a borrowed pickup truck, their 3-month-old daughter strapped to Jessica's chest in a carrier that made ordinary activities look like extreme sports. "This is what friends do," Jessica had said, when Maya tried to protest that new parents shouldn't spend their weekend hauling furniture. "Besides, Emma needs to learn early that community means showing up when people need you." The apartment on Fountain Avenue looked different, filled with Maya's belongings, than it had empty during the viewing. Her sage green bedroom furniture transformed the small space into something that felt familiar, and her books, arranged on the built-in shelves, made the living room look like home, rather than just housing. "It's perfect," Jessica said, balancing baby Emma while surveying the kitchen, where Maya's ceramic elephant collection had found new homes on the windowsill. "Small, but perfect." Maya nodded, though she was still learning to distinguish between perfect and possible, between gratitude and satisfaction. The apartment was affordable, safe, and available, qualities that had seemed negotiable 2 weeks ago, but now felt essential. The difference between wanting and needing had been clarified by a week of homelessness in ways that no amount of theoretical understanding could have achieved. By afternoon, the major pieces were in place, and Maya's friends had returned to their own lives, leaving her alone in her new space for the first time. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching walls that she was allowed to paint, adjusting furniture that would stay in the same configuration for months rather than days, opening and closing cabinets that held her dishes rather than someone else's temporary provisions. The silence felt different from hotel room silence, productive rather than empty, promising rather than waiting. Maya made coffee in her own kitchen, using her own cups, and sat in her reading chair by the window that looked out onto a tree-lined street where people walked dogs and children rode bicycles, and life proceeded with the kind of casual permanence she'd taken for granted until she lost it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Haven't heard from you all week. Starting to worry. Please call." Maya looked at the message for a long time, considering how to bridge the gap between her parents' world and the experiences of the past 2 weeks. How do you tell people who'd never been homeless that homelessness had taught you things about security, community, and resilience that you couldn't have learned any other way? How do you explain that displacement had been traumatic and educational, devastating and clarifying? She dialed the number, settling deeper into her reading chair as her mother's familiar voice filled the apartment. "There you are! I was starting to think something terrible had happened." "Something did happen," Maya said gently, "but it's resolved now." She told her parents the story in careful doses, watching their responses shift from concern to confusion to the particular helplessness that came from wanting to fix problems they couldn't reach across distance. Her father, practical as always, offered financial assistance that Maya no longer needed. Her mother asked twice if she was sure she wanted to stay in Los Angeles, given how expensive and unstable it seemed. "I'm sure," Maya said, though she was still learning what staying meant, what commitment looked like when you understood how quickly circumstances could change. After they hung up, Maya walked through her apartment again,
this time focusing not on what she had, but on what she'd learned. The past 2 weeks had stripped away assumptions about security that she'd been building her adult life around, revealing the temporary nature of what she'd believed to be permanent fixtures. But the loss of those illusions had also opened space for different kinds of understanding. She'd learned that homelessness wasn't a moral failing, but a structural problem that could affect anyone whose circumstances became too complicated for the systems designed to provide stability. She discovered that housing insecurity wasn't rare, but common, hidden behind the facade of professional competence and social propriety that most people maintained while privately struggling with rent increases and landlord whims and the basic mathematics of survival in expensive cities.
Maya opened her Italy journal and wrote, Day 11, first night in new apartment. Strange to realize that home is both more and less than I thought it was. More because having your own space, your own keys, your own address feels like magic after experiencing their absence. Less because I understand now that home is contingent, temporary, dependent on factors beyond individual control. But maybe that's not a loss of security. Maybe it's a more honest relationship with security. Maybe acknowledging the temporary nature of our circumstances allows us to value them more deeply while we have them, to build stronger communities because we understand that we all need each other in ways we don't always recognize. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Maya returned to work with the complicated relief of someone who'd learned not to take employment for granted while still needing it for survival. Janet's concern about her personal situation dissolved as Maya's performance returned to its previous consistency, but Maya carried with her a different relationship to professional stability. She understood now that being a good employee wasn't insurance against displacement, that competence couldn't protect against the cascade of circumstances that could disrupt anyone's carefully constructed life. Trevor, the senior designer whose corner office Maya had coveted, seemed smaller somehow. Not in physical stature, but in the sense that his professional authority was revealed as one kind of power among many, less decisive than the power to provide or deny housing, less immediate than the power to help or abandon someone in crisis. Good to have the old Maya back, Trevor said during a team meeting in November, apparently unaware that the old Maya no longer existed, had been replaced by someone who understood that professional identity was a performance that required stable foundations most people never thought to examine. Maya smiled and nodded, participating in the fiction that displacement had been a temporary disruption rather than a permanent education. She'd learned that most people preferred to believe that homelessness was unusual, that housing insecurity affected other kinds of people who made different kinds of choices. Acknowledging that it could happen to anyone threatened the comfort of believing that their own stability was earned rather than circumstantial. But Maya had also discovered communities of people who understood these realities without explanation. Maria, her new landlady, turned out to be part of a network of property managers who deliberately kept some units affordable, who prioritized long-term tenancy over maximum profit, who understood that housing was infrastructure rather than commodity. My family came here with nothing, Maria explained over coffee in her apartment office. We lived in places where landlords saw us as temporary income rather than human beings. I manage properties differently because I remember what it felt like to be at the mercy of other people's greed. Through Maria, Maya met other tenants who'd experienced displacement, job loss, family emergencies that had threatened their housing security. There was David, a teacher, whose rent had increased beyond his salary's reach, forcing him to move 3 times in 2 years. There was Carmen, a single mother whose landlord had refused to make necessary repairs, using the threat of eviction to avoid maintenance responsibilities. There was Frank, an older man whose fixed income had been rendered inadequate by neighborhood gentrification that priced him out of the neighborhood where he'd lived for 30 years.
Each story revealed different aspects of the same systemic failures. Housing treated as investment rather than human need. Housing protections that existed in theory but were difficult to enforce in practice. The way that individual emergencies became community crises when safety nets were inadequate to catch everyone who fell. But Maya had also discovered communities of people who understood these realities without explanation. With security deposits and moving expenses, she connected with housing advocates who were working to change policies that prioritized property owners' profits over residents' stability. By December, Maya had started volunteering with a nonprofit that provided temporary housing assistance for people experiencing displacement. 2 Saturday mornings a month, she helped process applications for emergency rental assistance, explaining programs and requirements to people whose circumstances mirrored her own experience from 2 months earlier. "The hardest part," said Rosa, the program coordinator who'd been doing this work for 15 years, "is helping people understand that needing help doesn't mean they failed. Our society teaches us that housing insecurity is a personal problem, but it's actually a structural issue that requires collective solutions." Maya recognized the truth of this from her own experience. She'd spent the first week of her displacement believing that better planning or different choices could have prevented her homelessness, that her situation reflected personal inadequacy rather than systemic design. Learning to see her experience as part of larger patterns had been painful but also liberating. Painful because it revealed how many people were struggling with similar insecurities, and liberating because it suggested that solutions required policy changes rather than individual perfection. Working with other people who were experiencing housing crises also taught Maya about the particular strengths that emerged from navigating instability. People who'd been homeless were often remarkably resourceful, expert at finding solutions with limited resources, skilled at building community among people who understood what it meant to need help. The clients she worked with taught her things about resilience and creativity that her comfortable life had never required. Elena visited in January, bringing homemade tamales and an update on Carlos's progress. Maya's former landlady looked more relaxed than she had during their difficult conversation months earlier, the weight of impossible choices replaced by the satisfaction of solutions that had worked out better than anyone had expected. "Carlos got promoted at the auto shop," Elena reported, settling into Maya's reading chair with the familiarity of someone who'd been forgiven. "He's taking night classes at the community college, studying to become a mechanic. His parole officer says he's doing better than most people who get out after long sentences." Maya felt genuine happiness for Carlos, though she also recognized the injustice embedded in his success story. He was thriving despite a system designed to ensure his failure, managing to build stability on foundations that could be disrupted at any moment by parole violations or employment changes or any of the other factors that made reintegration so precarious. "How are you doing with everything?" Elena asked. "I know the apartment is smaller than what you had before." "It's different," I said honestly. "But different isn't necessarily worse. I appreciate things now that I used to take for granted. Having my own key, being able to paint the walls, knowing that my mail will be delivered to the same address for more than a week." They talked for 2 hours, sharing updates about their lives while carefully avoiding direct discussion of the displacement that had brought them to this point. But the conversation carried the weight of shared experience, the particular intimacy that came from having navigated impossible circumstances together and emerging with their relationship intact, if changed. After Elena left, Maya walked through her apartment, touching furniture that had survived displacement, watering plants that had thrived despite being uprooted, arranging books that had been packed and unpacked and were now settled on shelves where they would stay long enough to gather dust. The routine of maintenance and care felt different than it had before her homelessness, not automatic, but intentional, not taken for granted, but appreciated as the privilege it was. Her Italy journal had evolved into something broader than travel memoir or displacement record.
Maya wrote in it regularly now, documenting not just her own experiences, but the stories she heard through her volunteer work, the policy changes she was learning about, the ways that understanding housing as a human right rather than market commodity was beginning to influence her other life choices. February 15th, helped process emergency rental assistance applications today. Met a woman whose landlord is trying to evict her so he can renovate and charge higher rent. She's been a good tenant for 3 years. But that doesn't matter when gentrification makes her affordability a liability rather than an asset. Gave her information about legal aid services, but the law moves slowly and displacement happens quickly.
March 2nd. Attended City Council meeting about rent stabilization ordinance. Amazing to see how many people showed up to speak about housing insecurity, to make visible the stories that usually stay private. Also depressing to see how many council members seem to view housing primarily as economic development rather than human need. Policy change is slow, but it's still change. March 20th, 1 year since I booked the Italy trip. Strange to think that what felt like a reward for hard work became the catalyst for learning things about security and community that comfortable stability never taught me. Not sure I would choose to experience displacement again, but I can't pretend it didn't teach me valuable things about resilience and interconnection. Spring brought news that Maya's building was being sold to a developer who planned extensive renovations. Maria called a tenant meeting to explain that while current leases would be honored, rent increases and building improvements would likely price out many long-term residents within 2 years. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied housing insecurity, but this time it was tempered by experience and community. She knew now that displacement was part of living in cities where housing was treated as commodity rather than infrastructure. She also knew that there were resources available, people who could help, ways of navigating crisis that didn't require facing everything alone. "We're going to form a tenants association," Maya announced at the meeting, surprising herself with a certainty in her voice. "We can't stop the sale, but we can organize to protect our rights during the transition." Over the following months, Maya found herself becoming the kind of person she'd needed during her own crisis, someone who understood the systems well enough to help other people navigate them, who had experienced displacement and learned that it didn't have to be faced in isolation. The tenants association she'd proposed grew into a network that provided practical support and political advocacy for people whose housing was threatened by gentrification and speculation. Working with other tenants taught Maya about the particular power that came from organizing people who shared common experiences of insecurity. They couldn't individually control housing markets or policy decisions, but collectively they could provide mutual aid, share resources, and advocate for changes that prioritized community stability over investor profits. By summer, Maya had been elected to the board of the nonprofit where she'd started volunteering, representing the perspective of people who'd experienced recent displacement. The work was challenging, underfunded organizations trying to address systemic problems with emergency solutions, but it was also meaningful in ways that her graphic design career, while financially necessary, had never been. "You've changed," Jessica observed during one of their regular coffee dates, Emma now old enough to sit in a high chair and throw Cheerios with impressive accuracy. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but you seem more grounded, I guess, more present." Maya considered this, thinking about the ways that experiencing instability had paradoxically made her feel more rooted in her community, more connected to other people's struggles and successes. "I think losing the illusion of security made me realize that real security comes from relationships and community rather than individual circumstances." "That's very philosophical," Jessica said with a smile, "but also very you. You always were the one who turned personal experiences into larger understanding." Maya laughed, recognizing the truth in her friend's observation. She had always been someone who processed experience through analysis and meaning-making, who looked for patterns that connected individual circumstances to broader social realities. Her displacement had provided material for that kind of processing, while also teaching her that analysis without action was incomplete. The 1-year anniversary of her return from Italy passed quietly, marked not by celebration, but by reflection on how much had changed since she'd stood on a rain-soaked sidewalk. Surrounded by boxes that contained her displaced life, Maya still lived in the same apartment, still worked at the same design firm,
still maintained routines that looked similar to those she'd established before her homelessness. But the similarities were surface level. Underneath, everything had been reorganized around different priorities and deeper understanding of what actually provided security in an insecure world. Maya now knew that home was temporary, that employment was contingent, that the systems designed to provide stability often created instability for people who couldn't afford to navigate their contradictions. She also knew that acknowledging these realities didn't require despair or cynicism, that understanding systemic problems opened possibilities for systemic solutions, that individual experiences of displacement could become collective action for housing justice. Maya's Italy journal had grown into multiple volumes, documenting not just her own journey from tourist to displaced person to housing advocate, but the stories of dozens of other people whose experiences had taught her about resilience, community, and the particular kinds of strength that emerged from navigating systems designed to exclude rather than support. August 24, 1 year exactly since I found my belongings on the sidewalk. Elena texted to check on me, which was sweet. Carlos sent a photo of his mechanic certification. Both gestures felt like acknowledgement that we're all still connected by what happened, that crisis creates relationships that outlast the crisis itself. The strangest thing about this anniversary is recognizing how much I've learned from an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone. Displacement taught me things about community, policy, and personal resilience that I couldn't have learned from books or conversations. But that education came at the cost of security, stability, and peace of mind that shouldn't be required curriculum for understanding how housing systems work. Maybe that's the point, though. Maybe the reason these systems persist in creating homelessness and housing insecurity is that the people with power to change them have never experienced their failures personally. Maybe having more people who understand displacement from the inside, working in policy and advocacy, creates possibilities for different kinds of solutions. Maya closed the journal and looked around her apartment. Still small, still affordable, still temporary in the sense that all housing was temporary when you understood the larger forces that shaped access to shelter. But it was also home in ways that transcended square footage or lease terms, filled with furniture that had survived displacement, books that had been packed and unpacked, and arranged on shelves where they would stay until the next crisis or opportunity required another move. Tomorrow, she would go to work and design marketing materials that sold dreams of stability to people who probably understood, better than the advertising suggested, that security was something you created rather than purchased. Tomorrow, she would also attend a tenants' rights meeting and help process emergency rental assistance applications, and continue the work of building community among people who understood that individual circumstances were connected to collective well-being. But tonight, she was simply a woman in her own space, surrounded by belongings that had weathered one displacement and would probably weather others, learning that home was both the place where you kept your things and the network of relationships that helped you rebuild when everything you thought was permanent revealed itself to be beautifully, precariously, necessarily temporary. 3 years later, Maya stood in the community room of the Maple Street Housing Cooperative, watching Elena arrange flowers in the blue ceramic vase that once sat on Maya's windowsill in the duplex. The vase had traveled through displacement, storage, and multiple apartments before finding its way here, to the building that had been purchased by a community land trust and converted to permanently affordable housing for people who understood what it meant to need home. Elena said, "The reporter should be here any minute," adjusting the sunflowers with the careful attention she'd always given to details. At 72, she looked remarkably similar to how she'd appeared 3 years ago, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd learned that difficult choices didn't have to result in permanent guilt.
Maya nodded, reviewing her notes for the interview. The Los Angeles Times was writing a story about innovative housing solutions, and the Maple Street Cooperative had been selected as an example of how communities could create alternatives to speculative real estate markets. Maya would be interviewed as a resident and board member, someone whose personal experience with displacement had informed her advocacy for housing justice.
Carlos emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee and pastries, his movements efficient and practiced. At 35, he looked like someone who'd found his place in the world. Steady employment at the auto shop he now co-owned, night school classes in business management, a small apartment in the cooperative where he served as building maintenance coordinator. The transformation was visible not just in his circumstances, but in his posture, the way he moved through space like someone who belonged there. Nervous? He asked Maya, setting down the tray with the careful precision that characterized everything he did. Excited mostly, Maya said, and realized she meant it. 3 years ago, she would have been nervous about public attention, concerned about how her story would be interpreted or whether her experience was significant enough to warrant media coverage. Now she understood that individual stories mattered precisely because they revealed larger patterns, that personal experiences of displacement became politically meaningful when they were connected to systemic analysis and collective action. The reporter arrived with the punctuality that suggested she'd covered enough community meetings to understand that people who organized around housing issues took time seriously. Sarah Chen from The Times looked younger than Maya had expected, but her questions revealed the kind of preparation that came from understanding housing policy beyond surface-level human interest angles. "Can you walk me through how the cooperative was formed?" Sarah asked, settling into one of the folding chairs that furnished the community room, with a combination of practicality and hopefulness. Maya launched into the story she'd told dozens of times over the past year, but each telling revealed new details, different emphases that reflected how her understanding of the project had evolved. The Maple Street Cooperative had begun with Maria Vasquez's decision to sell her building to the tenants rather than to developers who would have converted it to luxury condominiums. The community land trust model meant that the building would remain permanently affordable, owned collectively by residents who paid monthly fees but built equity in their community rather than individual property wealth. "What made you decide to live here rather than pursuing traditional homeownership?" Sarah asked. Maya glanced around the community room, which doubled as meeting space, children's play area, and informal social center for the 24-unit building. Through the windows, she could see the garden that residents had planted in what used to be a parking lot. Vegetables and flowers growing in raised beds built with lumber donated by Carlos's workplace. Traditional homeownership assumes that security comes from individual property accumulation, Maya said. But my experience taught me that real security comes from community, from knowing that your neighbors have stable housing too, from building systems that prioritize long-term affordability over short-term profit. She explained how the cooperative model addressed the problem she'd experienced during her displacement. Residents couldn't be evicted for landlord convenience, housing costs were kept affordable through community ownership, and decisions about building management were made collectively by people who lived there rather than by distant property managers or investors. "It's not perfect," Maya acknowledged. "Collective decision-making is slower than individual choice, and we still have to navigate city regulations and maintenance costs and all the other challenges that come with housing, but those challenges are shared rather than individual burdens." Sarah asked about Maya's work with the Regional Housing Advocacy Coalition, which had grown from the nonprofit where she'd started volunteering into a network of organizations pushing for policy changes that treated housing as infrastructure rather than commodity. Maya served on the policy committee, helping draft legislation that would create more community land trusts,
Provide tax incentives for cooperative ownership, and strengthen tenant protections against displacement. "The work is slow," Maya said, "but we're seeing changes. 3 new community land trusts have been established in the past year, and the City Council passed a right to organize ordinance that makes it easier for tenants to form associations and negotiate with landlords." Elena, who had been listening quietly, added her perspective on how the cooperative had changed not just housing, but community relationships. "Before, I was a landlord and Maya was a tenant. Carlos was a nephew who needed help. Those roles created certain kinds of power dynamics, certain obligations. Now we're all members of the same cooperative, making decisions together about how we want to live."
Carlos nodded, his expression thoughtful. Living here feels different from any other place I've been. In prison, you're always subject to other people's authority. In regular apartments, you're always wondering if the landlord will raise the rent or sell the building. Here, we're invested in each other's stability because our own stability depends on it. The interview continued for another hour, Sarah asking about the challenges of cooperative living, the financial model that made permanent affordability possible, and the ways that residents balanced individual privacy with collective responsibility. Maya found herself describing not just the practical aspects of the housing model, but the emotional experience of living in community with people who understood what it meant to need home. After Sarah left, Maya walked through the building's common areas, noting details that had become familiar over the 18 months she'd lived there. The bulletin board in the lobby was covered with notices about childcare exchanges, skill shares, and community meetings. The laundry room had been converted into an informal social space where residents gathered while waiting for cycles to complete. The rooftop had been transformed into additional garden space and an outdoor meeting area where the cooperative held monthly assemblies. Maya's apartment was on the 3rd floor, a one-bedroom unit that was larger than her previous place and cost significantly less than market-rate housing. She'd painted the walls the same sage green that had made her feel calm in the duplex, hung the same string lights in the kitchen that made ordinary meals feel celebratory. But the space felt different from her previous homes, more rooted, more permanent, more connected to the lives of people around her. Her Italy journal, now supplemented by several additional volumes, sat on the built-in shelves that had drawn her to the apartment. Maya opened the most recent volume and wrote, September 12th. Interview with LA Times Today about the cooperative. Strange to think that the worst experience of my adult life, being displaced from the duplex, led eventually to the most meaningful housing situation I've ever had. Not because displacement was good or necessary, but because experiencing housing insecurity taught me things about community and policy that I needed to know to create different kinds of solutions. The reporter asked if I would choose to go through the displacement again, knowing what I know now. The answer is obviously no. Nobody should have to experience homelessness to understand that housing is a human right. But I'm also grateful for how that experience changed my understanding of what security actually means, how individual circumstances are connected to collective well-being. Maya paused in her writing, thinking about the various ways her life had been shaped by that afternoon 3 years ago when she'd returned from Italy to find her belongings on the sidewalk. The displacement had been traumatic, but it had also been educational in ways that comfortable stability could never have been. She'd learned about policy and organizing and the particular strengths that emerged from navigating systems designed to exclude rather than support.